Hello, Flesh and Blood gamers. Today I got a video for newer players. I'm coming at you with a budget Azalea deck. But first I'm just going to talk a little bit about Azalea, why I think you should play her. She is a very strong hero in the meta right now. She's probably top 4, top 3, somewhere in there. So, there's an argument for her being the best deck in the format. I think if you're a newer player, you should just pick her up immediately. And today I have a deck that can easily introduce you to the hero. So why should you play Azalea? Well, Azalea has a very clear, strong game plan that can be done in every single matchup. She doesn't have to change her plan into anything. She basically is never going to block every single turn. She's going to activate Death Dealer, load an arrow, play some buffs, and then attack with a really big, effective on-hit. The second reason I think you should play Azalea is that she is very adaptable to metas. She has a large suite of highly effective arrows that can stop anywhere from strong fatigue strategies to non-blocking go-against strategies and even tall strategies. So she can really just attack the meta in a lot of different ways, and she isn't weak to any single playstyle. You can change her deck to be strong against people trying to counter her. She also has a very low skill floor and a very high skill ceiling, and I think this is actually very important as a budget player, because when you pick up the deck first, even though some of the cards are slightly weaker and you don't have all the majestics and legendaries that you would need to have a fully tuned deck, you can still learn the hero on a fundamental level and bring that to your play when you actually get to having all the staples and all of the best cards. When you first play Azalea, you're probably not going to have your Codex of Frailties, you're probably not going to have your Skullbone Crosswrap, but those cards aren't necessary to learn her at a very high level. So you can get started really at the ground floor, spending basically no money on this deck. And then as you get better, you can add some new cards. If your meta requires certain cards, then you can add those, and you can get very high skilled. She also has a very easy upgrade path. She starts with basically no cards that cost any money. The deck I'm going to show you has cards that are only commons and rares. There's no majestics, no legendaries. So if you lived in my area, which is the Pacific Northwest, you could very easily go into your local Discord and ask for all of these cards from locals, and they would most likely be able to give them to you. Maybe even your local game store has bulk, and you can search that to find your cards. You can really just build this deck from nothing. If you're a completely new player, you can play this game basically free to play by asking your local Discords, asking your locals, maybe you have some friends that are playing, and maybe your local game store has the cards you need. Let's move on to the deck. This is my Azalea super budget, no majestics, no legendaries deck. The most important card in Azalea is Death Dealer. Death Dealer as a card is probably the most powerful weapon in the game. What Death Dealer essentially means is that every single arrow that we're going to play is either a 1-card 5 with some on-hit, or loading it into your arsenal actually gains you a resource in the case of the 0-cost arrows. So we can play around that card advantage to have better turns than our opponents every single turn. Looking at the deck, you might see some cards that you haven't seen if you've been looking at tournament play, Tournament Azalea, for example, Headshot. This card is not the best arrow we could possibly be playing, but it is a 1-for-6, and in Azalea, a 1-for-6 is a 1-card 6. 1-card 6 is the best raid in the game, basically, without an on-hit. That's better than E-Strike Draw card. It's on par with things like Snatch, on-hit draw, especially considering this card blocks 3. Obviously, Infecting Shot is our best arrow in the deck. It's a 1-card 7. This is competitive with some of the craziest effects in the game, like, for example, Tunic Miraging Metamorph. And this doesn't even require Tunic. You can just, if you have a 2-card hand, you pitch a yellow, activate Death Dealer, load Infecting Shot, and fire Infecting Shot for 5+2 on hit. This card's insane. All of her buffs are also very good. All of them give +3 at red, except sometimes they have on-hits that can be extremely effective. For example, Lace with Blood Rot gives +3, and when an arrow hits a hero, we're going to make a Blood Rot token, and that's going to deal 2 damage to our opponent. It's extremely strong. Some other cards that we're including that might not make the main deck in certain metas, a Sedation Shot. This card is extremely strong in this meta. A lot of decks are setting up, and a lot of decks off of a 4-card hand are not going to be able to beat our value. But if they're setting up with a 5-card hand, they might be able to. Sedation Shot allows us to kill any chance of them being able to set up gigantic turns. And this card is just so strong against Earth. It's strong against all the lightning heroes. All the new heroes just get destroyed by Sedation Shot. It's also extremely good against Fatigue. So we need this in our deck, and we actually have a 3rd copy in the sideboard. The sideboard also includes 3 Murkmire Grapnel for Enigma. Azalea is actually fairly heavily favored into Enigma, and I think even just this budget version could be even or favored into Enigma with good player skill. And Murkmire Grapnel is part of that. Ward just can't prevent the damage from this. It's obviously insane. We have Fatigue Shot in here for Victor. I think Victor, as a matchup, is the one that really gets hurt the most by playing budget. Skullbone Crosswrap as a card is very good in the Fatigue matchups, but with good play, this deck can fight against the Fatigue. We have the Fatigue Shots for Victor, as well as the Scout the Peripheries and the Ravenous Rabbles to try and see what card is at the top of our deck. The Ravenous Rabble is the only non-buff, non-arrow card in our deck, and there simply isn't enough good pumps at 0 at common or rare, but Ravenous Rabble actually has a lot of interesting applications. It's always going to come in for at least 3, so oftentimes it is just Scout the Periphery, but sometimes we get to see an arrow on the top of our deck, and then we can give it Dominate with Azalea's hero ability. One thing that this deck at a budget level will struggle with is gameplay patterns, so I actually want to go over some gameplay patterns that maybe if you watch a competitively tuned deck list, they will be taking some gameplay patterns that actually won't work in the budget deck. So let's look at a standard hand. This is a 4-card hand. Our play pattern is pretty obvious. We pitch our blue to Death Dealer, load Bolden Shot, and then we play our 2 buffs and attack for 10. And that makes our hand a 3-card 10 at minimum. We will draw a card off the Death Dealer. If the card off the top was this Release the Tension, we could either have played the Release the Tension last turn, or we could have arsenaled it and had it for this upcoming turn. So that's just the regular play pattern of the deck, but because this deck doesn't have a Skullbone Crosswrap, oftentimes we actually are not able to effectively arsenal arrows, whereas in the Skullbone Crosswrap version, we would be able to arsenal arrows. So if you're playing this budget version, anytime we have an extra arrow, let's try and find a hand like that. Yeah. So in this version of the deck, you can't effectively arsenal one of these 3 arrows. Whereas if I was playing Azalea in my tuned list, then I would be able to. So in this hand, you would have to block with the Searing Shot probably, and we're going to load the Spire Sniping, pitching to Death Dealer and drawing a card. If we didn't have to do that, there's some consideration to just leaving the Searing Shot in our hand to arsenal it for next turn. But because we can't use the opt to switch this arrow for a non-attack guaranteed, we really can't afford to be arsenaling it. So we have to block with it. Looking at the pricing for our budget deck, it says $20 here, but everything in this list is commons or rares. The only card that you might not be able to get just by asking on your local Discord is Blossom of Spring. Blossom of Spring is the best chess piece at common or rare, but it wasn't released in a set. It was actually released as a promo and in starter decks. So it's possible somebody just has an extra starter deck lying around and is willing to give it to you. Maybe you pay $1 for it. Or I do have in the maybe board the Threadbare Tunic. The issue with Threadbare Tunic is that you can't actually activate Death Dealer with it. Blossom Spring does allow you to do that, but Threadbare Tunic doesn't. Other than that, they're about the same. Oftentimes, what you can do is you load an arrow with a red, and then play out 3 or 4 buffs, and then just activate Threadbare Tunic with an empty hand, and then send your arrow for, 14, 17. The numbers get really big. I want to talk about some of the inclusions that might be somewhat esoteric for a newer player. Ragmuffin's hat is very interesting because if you have an arrow as the last card in your hand, what you get to do is you can activate Ragmuffin's hat to switch that arrow for your top card. So you get to change your arrow into a buff, and then know that when you use Azalea's activated ability to put an arrow from the top of your deck into your arsenal, that you're going to have Dominate. So this allows us one extremely big Dominate turn when we have a 3-arrow hand. I think this card is actually quite good in Azalea, but Skullbone Crosswrap is so good that no other headpiece is really going to compete with it. So I have Ragamuffins in the budget build. In the sideboard, I have Honing Hood, which actually is kind of similar to the Majestic Arm Piece that allows us to play around Warmonger's Diplomacy. Sometimes, if somebody plays Warmonger's Diplomacy and you have a non-attack in your arsenal, you just lose the game on the spot. You can't play the non-attack, so you can't play an arrow. But Honing Hood actually allows us to switch that non-attack for an arrow and still send an arrow for 5, or in the case of Infecting Shot for 7. So I think this card is actually very good into any deck where they would be playing Warmonger's Diplomacy, which includes Ninja and Illusionist. We have the Spellfray for Kano, and this deck, by default, always plays 1 Arcane Barrier, so against the Rune Blades, we probably aren't pitching to Rune Chance anyways, but we have the AB in case we need it in an endgame scenario. I'm going to show what a deck looks like that's very finely tuned to show the upgrade path. We obviously have Tunic and Crosswrap in our equipment slot, and those cards are extremely strong. We have some upgrades to arrows in the main deck. Endless Arrow is quite good. The big one, though, is Red in the Ledger. This card allows us to have very dominant matches against ninjas, against Aurora and Acilio, decks that really want to go again. And against the Rune Blades, the other Rune Blades as well. This card can be extremely strong and shut down an entire turn. It can turn a dominated Red in the Ledger and turn a 5-card hand into 4 damage. This card is just extremely strong. There's a reason it's an Azalea specialization, and actually it's only about $4 right now. So the first upgrade I would make to this $20 commons and rares only budget deck is buying a 4 of Red in the Ledger, and when you do that, you should actually purchase the Long Draw Half Glove. If you can get this 40-cent card in your shipping with your Red in the Ledgers, you will be able to much better play around Warmonger's Diplomacy, and oftentimes the first Warmonger's Diplomacy will just be playing. One of the buffs that is quite important in this meta is Seek and Destroy. It pairs well with Release the Tension, making it so that if you have a dominated arrow that's big enough that they can't block, and they have a D-React in Arsenal, they just lose that forever. Seek and Destroy, extremely strong right now. That would probably be the next card I would purchase. It's about $3 for a single copy, $9 for the playset. But in this current meta, it's extremely strong. After that, I would buy Skullbone Crosswrap. $40. It's a hefty investment if you're getting into card games for the first time. But this is one of the cheaper legendaries, actually, and the effect on your deck will be immense. There is no replacing Skullbone Crosswrap in this deck. It allows you to make so many different plays that may seem risky on its face, but because you know you're going to get that opt, you will be able to put arrows in your arsenal, you'll be able to draw better turn over turn, you'll be able to stack your deck better for the end game in the fatigue matchups. This card is extremely important, and I would buy it before many of the other play sets of powerful cards. I would definitely buy this before buying even one Codex of Frailty, I'd buy this before buying one Premeditate. I think this card is better than Rain Razors. You definitely need this in your deck. So this would be the first legendary, and honestly, Tunic is in this deck. Tunic is extremely strong in this deck. It allows us to activate Tunic and load a 0-cost arrow and attack for 16, but this card is too expensive for what it is in this deck. Blossom of Spring is basically as good in a lot of matchups. The only matchups where you really feel it is against Assassin and against Victor. So you'll also feel it against the Earth Heroes, but I don't think in those matchups it's as stark of a difference as it is against really the Assassins. That's the big one. So I don't even think you should think about Tunic in this deck until you've purchased all of the main deck cards. It's really just not a big deal. The next card is Rain Razors. This card's pretty expensive. Came out in Everfest, which has a weird release cycle, but Rain Razors is really strong. In our deck, we have 7 Bolden Shots in the version that is extremely tuned, and in the budget version, we have 8. Rain Razors and Bolden Shot pair really well because the reload, if we have 2 Bolden Shots in hand, allows us to play both of them even before we've activated Death Dealer. Once you have Rain Razors in your deck, Archling Bolden Shot becomes a much higher value play, because if you draw Rain Razors, you just get to play the Bolden Shot for 4 and make your opponent think about, oh, how many Rain Razors do you have in hand? Do they want to give you this reload? If you have another Bolden Shot in hand, when you play Rain Razors on a Bolden Shot, you can really punish your opponent for not blocking. So I think Rain Razors is actually extremely strong. I wouldn't buy it before any of the other things. The other good part about Rain Razors is that it's a yellow, so it also acts well in our pitch. And we can always just pitch a yellow on our turns. We never have to pitch a blue, so this card's extremely strong. The next card I would purchase is Knock the Death Whistle. This card is a little cheaper than the other cards on the list, so if you have a couple dollars around, buying this, it won't hurt. This card is quite good. However, I do think Knock the Death Whistle actually introduces some play patterns that will lose you games. If you're playing Knock the Death Whistle and it's not turn 0 or the last turn of the game, oftentimes you're simply losing value. This card does not actually give you a buff. It only finds arrows when either you don't have one or an extremely effective arrow. This card is really good against Ninja, but Ninja's not a part of the meta right now. So I don't think you really need to be playing this card in your deck at the moment. I don't think it'll have as big of an impact as maybe the card reads. In a lot of other card games, tutors are some of the most powerful cards in your deck. And Knock is powerful, but I don't think it's on the same level as any of the cards. I think this probably is actually the lowest power level Majestic in the list. So I would buy it at this point, but if you have a couple dollars around, you can definitely pay $3, get your playset, and you'll be set for life. Remorseless. This card is extremely strong in the meta, but it is $15 for one copy, $40 for a playset. This is where some of the cost of our cards really skyrocket. $45 for cards that don't even start on the battlefield is quite high, and this card is extremely hard to play with. If you are a new player, you will not notice when Remorseless is good. So I might not buy this card until I have reps in Azalea. It took me probably the first 100 games to really understand why Remorseless was a good card. But Remorseless is so strong right now, especially in combination with Inertia and Seek and Destroy, that it definitely needs to be in your tuned lists. So you will need to spend $45 if you're trying to get Azalea to, winning callings, winning your local pro quests. I think you definitely need Remorseless in your deck, and you need to understand how Remorseless works. But if you're just starting out, definitely don't buy these. This is probably the lowest impact arrow in your deck when you're starting out, so I wouldn't worry about this card too much. The next card I would purchase is Amplifying Arrow. This card is $3 and $9 for a playset. It's not too expensive, but currently in the budget list, I have the yellow Murkmire Grapnels in its place. And there are times where I think I actually might want to add the Murkmire Grapnel in my tuned list, but Amplifying Arrow is actually quite strong, especially when activated with Tunic. If you play 5 buffs with Amplifying Arrow and send Amplifying Arrow for 22, it's really strong. It's always going to hit, and you get all the on-hits from your buffs. So I would definitely get this card at some point. It is cheaper than Remorseless, but it's less effective. It is a yellow, so it actually fits in our cost curve extremely well. But it probably is one of the least impactful arrows. If I'm sending this arrow in a game, I'm only ever sending it once in a game, whereas most of our other arrows, like Red in the Ledger, even Sedation Shot, Remorseless, I'm trying to send more than Amplifying Arrow. This card's almost always pitched, so it being another yellow is simply okay. This card is quite good, but I don't think you need to spend $9 on it until you've really come to love Azalea and you want to build out the deck. The next card is Premeditate. This card's $20 a copy, and interestingly, it's actually the same price foil and non-foil, so, you know, if you like foils, maybe you pick it up. Premeditate is so strong. This card is +3 in a Ponder token, and oftentimes, especially if we already have the cross-wrap in our list, Ponder, we get to... Anytime you draw a card, you can think of that as being 3 value. So this is kind of a 0 for 6, but we're always putting it in our arsenal, which means that we get a cross-wrap value off of it, which in my head I equate to like a full point of value, which means that this is really a 0 for 7, and I mean, that's the craziest rate you've ever seen in your life. So yeah, this card's crazy, but it's really expensive. I wouldn't worry about getting it until you're really far in your Azalea career. And then the last card I would purchase is Codex of Frailty. Yeah, I mean, this card's crazy. This is the best card in the deck. But it's too expensive. It's $75. There's a lot of reasons for that, but this would be the last card I'd purchase for the deck. I think that this and Tunic, you will feel not having Codex of Frailty in your deck way more than Tunic. But I do think Tunic is actually a better purchase. So I would probably even buy this after Tunic, just because you can put Tunic in so many decks. When you play any other hero, you can just shove your Tunic in, and Tunic will be great. And Codex doesn't really have that sort of flexibility with it. It's obviously an Assassin card too, but Assassin's also an insanely expensive class. So if you're a new player, you're probably not doing this. I would definitely, if I was a new player, I would definitely not buy Codex of Frailty. This card is extremely strong. It will win you games that you have no reason to win, but you don't need it, and I wouldn't purchase it until I've got basically everything else filled out. There's one card that I actually didn't even talk about in the upgrade path, and that card is Endless Arrow. I think about cutting Endless Arrow often. It's really good. You need it in your list, but I don't love it. Oftentimes it can get clunky, and I would buy it even after like Tunic. Maybe you can trade for it. Like, I wouldn't spend money on this card. It's quite good, but I think Searing Shot really just works in its place, and I wouldn't be spending money on it before at least like Codex of Frailty. That's my Azalea budget deck with an upgrade guide. If you are looking for more budget decks, I would love to make some. I play a lot of heroes, and I've been building budget decks for a long time for local players. So if you're interested in that, comment and let me know, and give this video a like, and I'll start making other budget deck guides. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. If you do it, I'll feed my cat. If you don't, he's gonna die, so make sure to do it.